January 17, 1945. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow fell without mercy. It did not care for flags, for uniforms, for the names whispered into frozen air by those who would not see spring. The forest, ancient and indifferent, bore witness as it had for centuries to Romans, to Carolingians, to Napoleon's frozen columns. Now it watched again as the Reich's final gamble collapsed into the white silence of a European winter that refused to forgive. In a makeshift aid station, little more than canvas stretched between shattered pines, an American medic named Robert Kellerman worked by the light of a kerosene lamp that flickered like a dying prayer. His hands, numb despite wool gloves cut at the fingers, moved across wounds that no training manual had prepared him for. The Battle of the Bulge had entered its 5th week. What Hitler had christened Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, had become a graveyard of steel and youth. A last convulsion of a regime that had promised 1,000 years and delivered only ash. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius. Inside, it was perhaps 5 degrees warmer. Breath condensed into small clouds that hung momentarily before dissolving, as if souls themselves were testing the air before deciding whether to stay or depart. Kellerman had stopped counting the wounded 3 days prior. There were simply too many. American, British, German. It no longer mattered in this cathedral of suffering. The Geneva Convention was a thin thread of civilization stretched across an abyss, and he clung to it with the same desperation that men clung to their rifles. It was then that they brought her in. She wore the Feldgrau of the Wehrmacht, but the uniform hung wrong on her frame, too large in the shoulders, cinched desperately at the waist with rope. Her face was the color of November rain, gray and drawn, and across her left side spread a dark stain that the snow had tried and failed to hide. 2 American infantrymen carried her on a stretcher fashioned from a barn door, their expressions caught between duty and confusion. "German prisoner, Doc," one of them said, his Kentucky accent softening the hard consonants. "Found her in a foxhole about half a click west. Well, you can see." Kellerman could see. The wound was severe shrapnel, likely from American artillery, had torn through her rib cage. In the dim light, he could also see something else. The fear in her eyes was not the fear of an enemy, but the universal terror of a human being confronting mortality far from home. "Set her there," he said, gesturing to a space he'd cleared between a lieutenant with frostbite and a corporal, whose leg had been amputated 12 hours earlier. The soldiers hesitated. Outside, the sound of distant artillery provided a bass note to the wind's soprano. Someone was still dying out there. Someone was always dying. "Doc, she's German," the other soldier said, his Chicago vowels flat and certain. "She's bleeding," Kellerman replied. "Same as everyone else." History would later record that approximately 19,000 women served in the Wehrmacht and SS in various capacities by 1945, though the exact number remains obscured by the chaos of the Reich's collapse. They were not supposed to be there, not officially. Germany's vision of womanhood, carefully cultivated through a decade of propaganda, placed the Aryan woman in the home, in the kitchen, bearing children for the fatherland. Kinder, Kuch, Kirche children, kitchen, church. This was the trinity of Nazi femininity, repeated in posters and radio broadcasts, and the speeches of party officials who stood before crowds and promised a return to traditional values, even as they built industrial murder on a scale never before imagined. But ideology has a way of bending when the front lines collapse. By late 1944, with Army Group Center destroyed in Operation Bagration and the Red Army driving toward East Prussia, the Reich's manpower reserves had been exhausted. The Hitler Youth were being handed Panzerfausts and told to stop T-34s, old men of the Volkssturm drilled with wooden Rifles and Dreams of 1914, and Women Some Volunteers. Some conscripted, all desperate, found themselves in uniforms that had never been designed for them, holding roles that ideology said they should never fill. This woman Kellerman would later learn her name was Marguerite, though she never gave a surname, was one of thousands who had served as Flakhelferin, anti-aircraft auxiliaries or communication specialists, or in the tangled logistics networks that kept German armies in the field, even as the field itself shrank daily. How she had ended up in a foxhole in the Ardennes, armed and alone, would remain a mystery. Perhaps her unit had been overrun. Perhaps she had fled. Perhaps, like so many in those final months, she had simply been swept along in the chaos of a civilization consuming itself. What mattered now was the wound, and the way her breathing came in short. Desperate gasps that misted the air. Kellerman cut away the uniform with scissors that had cut away dozens of uniforms before. Beneath, she wore a thin cotton undershirt, government issue, marked with a laundry stamp that was unreadable in the dim light. Her skin was corpse pale, mapped with veins like rivers on parchment. The shrapnel wound was worse than he'd thought. 3 separate entry points, one near the lung. He could hear the wet rattle of internal bleeding. "Morphine," he called to his assistant. A 19-year-old from Ohio named Patterson, who had been a pharmacy student before the draft found him. Patterson hesitated, the syringe in his hand. "Doc, we're low. Real low. Captain said to conserve for our boys." The aid station fell quiet except for the breathing dozens of men breathing at different rates, different rhythms, a broken orchestra of survival. Kellerman felt the weight of that silence, felt the eyes of the wounded Americans watching, judging, waiting to see what he would do. The Geneva Convention was clear. Enemy wounded were to be treated the same as friendly wounded, as far as supplies allowed. But supplies did not allow for much, and the convention was words on paper signed in a Swiss city that seemed to exist in another universe entirely. A universe where men in suits debated humanitarian law while sipping coffee that was actually coffee. Not the ersatz grain mixture that both armies now drank and pretended was the same thing. "Give her the morphine," Kellerman said. Patterson administered the injection. After a moment, Marguerite's breathing eased slightly, though her eyes remained open, fixed on the canvas ceiling as if she could see through it to the sky beyond, to some place where wars did not reach. She spoke only once in those first hours, and so softly that Kellerman almost missed it. He was cleaning the wound, applying sulfa powder that the army supplied in small packets with instructions printed in efficient sans serif type. When her lips moved, "Ich will hire nix sterben," she whispered. Kellerman's German was poor a semester in college before he'd switched to pre-med, but he understood. "I don't want to die here, not in Germany, not in the fatherland. Here, in this forest, in this foreign land, in this canvas tomb lit by American kerosene and warmed by American coal and sustained by American supplies that arrived with a regularity that must have seemed impossible to someone who had watched the Reich's logistics collapse into horse-drawn wagons and desperate railway schedules, disrupted by Allied bombers. "You're not going to die," he said, though he did not know if she understood English, and he did not know if he was telling the truth. But then she said something else, still in German, still barely audible. "Er habt so viel. You have so much." It was not a military observation. It was not intelligence, not a tactical assessment. It was something deeper, something that cut through the layers of propaganda and indoctrination and ideology to reach a fundamental human recognition, the staggering, almost incomprehensible, material abundance of the American war machine. This was the revelation that shattered German expectations again and again. From North Africa to Normandy to the Ardennes, they had been told that America was soft, decadent, a mongrel nation of shopkeepers and Hollywood illusions. A place where men had grown weak on jazz and democracy and the mixing of races. Goebbels had said it. Hitler had said it. Every newsreel and radio broadcast had reinforced it. America could not fight, would not fight, and even if it tried, it could not match the steel and will of the German soldier. But the German soldier, lying in a foxhole as American artillery bracketed his position with rounds that arrived in such quantities that it seemed the Americans must be printing shells the way they printed dollar bills, discovered a different truth. The Americans had everything. They had cigarettes in sealed packs, not the trash tobacco of late-war Germany. They had chocolate that was actually chocolate, not ersatz sweetness cut with God knew what. They had boots that fit, socks without holes, rations that included meat and coffee and sugar. When German forces overran American positions during the initial days of the Bulge, they found supply dumps that defied comprehension. One Wehrmacht unit discovered a depot containing 50,000 gallons of gasoline, more fuel than their entire division had seen in 3 months. Soldiers who had been eating bread made with sawdust found American K rations and thought they had discovered an officer's private store, only to learn that every American soldier ate this well. Tankers who had been nursing their last drops of fuel watched American Shermans maneuver freely, seemingly without concern for consumption, because behind them stretched a supply line that ran back across the Atlantic to factories that worked 3 shifts, to oil fields that had never seen a bomb, to a homeland that was not being burned and starved and crushed between 2 advancing armies. Er habt so viel. You have so much. It was an admission that cut deeper than any battlefield defeat, because it acknowledged that the war had never been equal, that the struggle had been against an enemy who fought with a carelessness born of plenty, who could afford to waste ammunition and fuel and even lives because there was always more. Always another ship arriving, always another factory producing, always another train rolling forward with supplies that would never run out. Marguerite had expected to die for Germany. This much was clear from the fragments she murmured as the morphine took hold and loosened the careful controls of consciousness. She spoke of her father, a veteran of the First War who had returned to find his country in chaos, his savings worthless, his pride destroyed. She spoke of the Hitler Youth meetings where she had learned to march and sing and believe that Germany would rise again, that the shame of Versailles would be avenged, that the Volk would reclaim their rightful place. She had believed. They had all believed. The generation that came of age under the swastika had known nothing else, had been too young to remember the Weimar Republic, too sheltered to see the terror behind the parades, too indoctrinated to question the logic that led from economic recovery to racial law to continental war. They had been taught that sacrifice was noble, that the individual meant nothing against the collective, that death in service to the Reich was the highest honor a German could achieve. But here, in the Ardennes, bleeding into a mattress stuffed with straw, Marguerite had whispered something different. Not a complaint about the wound, not anger at the enemy, just that simple, devastating observation. You have so much. It was the kind of thing that soldiers noticed but rarely spoke aloud, because to acknowledge it was to question everything. If the enemy was supposed to be weak but had endless supplies, what did that say about German strength? If American soldiers were supposed to be soft but kept coming forward no matter how many were killed, what did that say about German will? If the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh could outproduce all of Europe combined, what did that say about the economic theories that had promised German self-sufficiency? Kellerman worked through the night. The wound required careful debridement, removal of shrapnel and dead tissue, and then stitching, layer by layer, internal and external. His hands moved with a precision learned in medical school in Philadelphia, refined in field hospitals from Normandy forward. He did not think about whether she deserved this care. He did not think about the swastika that had been stenciled on the crate she must have once guarded. or the Wehrmacht that had started this war, or the camps that soldiers were beginning to whisper about. The camps where the Germans had done things that seemed to belong to a darker century entirely. He thought only about the wound, about the thread pulling through flesh, about the rhythm of surgery that was the same whether the patient wore Feldgrau or olive drab dot by dawn. He had done what he could. She was stable, though weak. The infection was the danger. Now sepsis killed more men than bullets in these conditions, but he had sulfa and clean bandages. And if luck held, if her body was strong enough, she might survive. As the winter sun rose pale and distant through the trees, Patterson brought him coffee. Real coffee, sent from home in a package that had traveled thousands of miles through U-boat-infested waters, across French roads, up to the front in a supply truck that had simply appeared because the Americans always had another truck. Another shipment, another train. Kellerman drank, and the warmth spread through him, and he wondered if Marguerite had ever tasted real coffee, or if her entire adult life had been spent drinking the ersatz substitute that symbolized everything the Reich had become a lie dressed up as truth. Bitterness masked as strength. The records show that Marguerite Fischer, she finally gave her surname on the third day, survived. She was transferred to a prisoner of war facility in France, and from there, eventually, to a displaced persons camp in the chaos of post-war Europe. Kellerman never saw her again. The war moved on, as wars do, grinding forward toward the Rhine and beyond, and he moved with it. Through towns with names he could not pronounce, past refugees and rubble, and the slowly emerging evidence of just how deep the darkness had been. But he kept a small note she had written, in pencil on a scrap of paper torn from an American supply manifest. Her handwriting was careful, the English painstakingly constructed. "Thank you for the life. I did not think the enemy would give life. We were told you would not. I am sorry." What she was sorry for, she did not specify. Perhaps for the war. Perhaps for believing. Perhaps for the simple human failing of trusting what she had been told, of accepting the narrative provided by authority, of marching forward into darkness while singing songs about light. The Battle of the Bulge claimed approximately 19,000 American lives and 67,000 casualties overall for the United States. German losses were catastrophic. Estimates range from 67,000 to 100,000 casualties, including soldiers who would never be found, who simply vanished into the snow and the chaos and the collapse. The offensive had been Hitler's last gamble, a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp, to buy time, to achieve something, anything that might forestall the inevitable. It failed. Not because German soldiers lacked courage, not because their tactics were flawed. It failed because courage and tactics could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic of the war. The Americans lost tanks and replaced them within days. The Germans lost tanks and painted the loss as a tactical withdrawal. The Americans fired artillery shells by the thousands, reshaping landscapes with high explosive. The Germans rationed shells and told their gunners to make every shot count, as if we could multiply ammunition. Marguerite had seen this truth in the aid station. You have so much. And in that observation lay the epitaph of the Third Reich, which had promised 1,000 years, but had not accounted for the fact that totalitarian control, no matter how ruthless, could not match the productive capacity of a free society mobilized for war. The Reich had squeezed every last resource from conquered Europe, had worked prisoners to death in pursuit of production, had bent every aspect of civilian life toward military necessity, and still, it was not enough. Still, the Americans had more. There's a photograph, taken in May 1945, of a Wehrmacht soldier standing in the ruins of Berlin. He is perhaps 20 years old, perhaps younger. The dirt and exhaustion make age difficult to judge. Behind him, the Reichstag burns. Around him, The wreckage of a capital that had once hosted Olympics and rallies now spreads in every direction. A landscape of broken stone and twisted metal and silenced guns. His face is empty. Not angry. Not grieving. Just empty, as if something fundamental has been scooped out and discarded. He had believed in something, and that something had led here. To this, Marguerite never returned to Germany, according to the fragmentary records that survived. She immigrated to Canada in 1951, changed her name, worked as a nurse in Toronto until her retirement. She married, had children, lived a quiet life that left no historical footprint beyond birth certificates and tax records and a small obituary in 1993 that mentioned her service in wartime Europe without specifying which side, but in that aid station in the Ardennes. On that January night when the temperature dropped below -15 and men died of cold as much as combat, she had whispered something that captured a truth about the war that numbers and maps and battle reports could not. The recognition that abundance was a weapon. That democracy was not weakness but terrible strength. That a nation built on voluntary cooperation could, when necessary, mobilize with a totality that made tyranny look impoverished by comparison. Kellerman returned to Philadelphia in 1946. He opened a practice in a neighborhood of row houses and corner stores. Married his sweetheart from before the war. Raised 3 children who never went hungry. Never wore threadbare clothes. Never heard artillery in the distance. He did not speak much about the war. Most veterans did not. The experience was too large, too complex, too soaked in moral ambiguities that had no place in the post-war narrative of good versus evil, heroes versus villains, light versus dark, but sometimes late at night, when the house was quiet and the city outside hummed with the prosperity of the American century. He thought about that moment when he'd decided to give morphine to an enemy soldier. It had not felt heroic. It had felt necessary as breathing. As if to do otherwise would have been to cross a line from which there was no return. To become something that the war wanted to make him, but that he refused to be. The Geneva Convention had been words on paper. What mattered was the choice he made, the choice to see Marguerite not as German or enemy or obstacle, but as a human being bleeding in the snow, whispering a prayer that needed no translation because fear and pain spoke a language older than nations. There is a danger, in retrospect, of making the war too clean, too simple. The Allies were not saints. The Americans who landed at Normandy and fought through France and crossed the Rhine did not do so purely for ideals. They fought because they were ordered to fight, because their friends were fighting, because going home meant going forward. They committed their own atrocities, prisoners shot, civilians killed, rules broken in the fog and fear and exhaustion of combat. But there was a difference, and the difference mattered. The American soldier who liberated a concentration camp and saw the mountains of shoes, the ovens, the living skeletons who could barely comprehend that they had been saved, that soldier represented, however imperfectly, a nation that had not built those camps. The British soldier who fought across North Africa and through Italy carried the weight of empire. Yes, but also the hope that empire might be dismantled, that the old orders might give way to something better. The German soldier, the ordinary Lanzer, who had believed the propaganda and done his duty and perhaps never committed a war crime, himself still served a regime whose entire purpose was conquest and subjugation, and the implementation of theories about race and blood that led inevitably to mass murder. Intent mattered. Ideology mattered. The flag you carried said something about the world you were trying to create. Marguerite had fought for Germany. But when she whispered, "Ich will hire nicht sterben," she was not thinking of the fatherland or the Führer or the promises made in torchlit rallies. She was thinking of life, simple and profound. The universal human desire to see another sunrise, to breathe free air, to continue existing in a world that was trying very hard to kill her. And when she said, "Ihr habt so viel," she was acknowledging that the Reich's promises had been lies. Not lies about honor or courage or sacrifice. German soldiers had proven those in abundance. Lies about strength, about self-sufficiency, about the superiority of the totalitarian model. The Americans had so much because they came from a place that could produce so much. A place where factories were built not by slaves, but by workers who bargained for wages. Where food was grown not by conquered peasants, but by farmers who owned their land. Where the entire apparatus of war production ran on voluntary cooperation, backed by laws that, however imperfectly applied, recognized the individual as something more than a cog in the state machine. This was the terrible revelation. That freedom was not weakness but strength. That the things the Reich despised, democracy, diversity, debate, were sources of power that tyranny could never match. The snow fell on the Ardennes for another 3 weeks before the weather finally broke. When spring came, it revealed a landscape transformed, forests stripped bare by artillery, towns reduced to rubble, fields cratered and sown with metal that would kill farmers for generations. The dead were buried in temporary graves that would later be relocated to cemeteries, where white crosses stretched in perfect rows. Geometric and final, Marguerite's wound healed, leaving a scar that she would carry for the rest of her life. She never spoke publicly about her experience. There are no interviews, no memoirs, no recordings for posterity. She became one of millions who had survived the war and then spent decades trying to forget it. Trying to build normal lives in the shadow of events that could never be truly left behind. But Kellerman kept her note. It sat in a desk drawer in his Philadelphia office, tucked between insurance papers and family photographs. A small piece of paper with careful English handwriting that testified to a moment when the war had become personal, immediate, stripped of propaganda, and reduced to a simple transaction. One human being trying to save another. Regardless of uniform, regardless of flag, regardless of the ideologies that had sent them both to that frozen forest. I did not think the enemy would give life. We were told you would not. What had they been told? That Americans were weak? That democracy was decadent? That the mongrel armies of the West could not stand against German discipline and will? All of this and more. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent a decade crafting a narrative of German superiority and Allied weakness, had built an entire worldview in which the Reich was destined to triumph because history, race, and blood demanded it. And then German soldiers had met the Americans in combat and discovered that the enemy had more tanks, more planes, more ammunition, more fuel, more food, more medicine, more of everything. They discovered that the weak, decadent democracy could mobilize with terrifying efficiency. They discovered that the mongrel armies fought with a determination that matched their own, backed by resources that seemed limitless. The revelation was ideological as much as military. If the Americans could produce like this, organize like this, fight like this, then perhaps the theories about racial superiority and totalitarian efficiency were wrong. Perhaps freedom was not a luxury, but a foundation. Perhaps the individual, properly respected and empowered, was worth more than any number of obedient automatons. Marguerite had glimpsed this truth in an aid station where an American medic chose to save her life. Not because regulations demanded it, not because propaganda said it was right, but because, in that moment, human decency overrode everything else. The medic had the power to let her die, to conserve morphine, to prioritize American casualties, to do what any soldier might understand in the cold calculus of war. Instead, he had chosen mercy. This was the democracy the Reich had called weak, a system where individuals could make moral choices, where compassion was not crushed beneath the weight of ideology, where even in war, even in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, There was room for the recognition that the enemy, too, was human. By the time the war ended, Germany lay in ruins. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were heaps of broken stone. The industrial base that had sustained the Wehrmacht was silent, bombed into oblivion. Millions were dead, millions more displaced. The Reich that was supposed to last a millennium had collapsed in 12 years, taking with it not just Germany, but the illusion that totalitarianism could compete with democracy in any meaningful way. The Americans, meanwhile, emerged from the war as the most powerful nation on earth. Their homeland had never been bombed. Their factories had expanded, not contracted. Their casualties, though grievous, were a fraction of what the Soviets or Germans or Japanese had suffered. They had, in every sense that mattered, won not just the war, but the argument about which system, which way of organizing human society was superior. And yet, the victory was not clean. The atomic bombs that ended the Pacific War introduced a new horror. The emerging Cold War made clear that the peace would be armed, tense, dangerous. The promise of a world free from tyranny foundered on the reality that Soviet tyranny now stretched across half of Europe, backed by armies that had paid the bloodiest price for Hitler's defeat. Still, there was the note. The small piece of paper in Kellerman's desk. The evidence that even in war, even in the depths of hatred and violence, human connection was possible. Marguerite had expected to die hating the enemy. Instead, she had lived because the enemy had chosen mercy. If you stand in the Ardennes today, you can still find traces of the battle. Foxholes dug into hillsides. Fragments of shell casings in the soil. Memorials where towns used to be. The forest has grown back, patient and persistent, covering the scars with green silence. But the revelation remains. The recognition that Marguerite whispered in that aid station echoes still. "Ihr habt so viel." You have so much. It was not just about material abundance, though that was part of it. It was about the fundamental truth that a free people, when threatened, can mobilize with a totality that makes tyranny look impoverished. That democracy, far from being weak, is capable of terrible and focused strength. That the values despised by fascism, individual rights, diverse perspectives, open debate, are not obstacles to power but sources of it. The Reich had promised efficiency and delivered chaos. It had promised strength and delivered defeat. It had promised 1,000 years and burned out in 12. And in the ruins, in the displacement camps, in the aid stations where enemies became patients and patients became human again, the survivors learned what Marguerite had glimpsed, that the ideology they had served was not just evil but false, not just wrong but fundamentally weak, unable to sustain itself against the combined might of nations that, for all their flaws, recognized the value of the individual human life. Kellerman died in 1987, an old man who had lived long enough to see the Berlin Wall and the Cold War and the gradual reconstruction of Europe. His children found the note when they cleaned out his office. They did not know the full story. He had never told them about Marguerite, about the choice he made in the Ardennes, about the moment when war became something more than strategy and casualties and objectives. But they kept the note. It sits now in a small museum in Pennsylvania, displayed in a case alongside his Purple Heart and his medical instruments and a photograph of him in uniform, young and serious. Before the war had taught him what human beings were capable of doing to each other. The note's careful. English still speaks across the decades. "Thank you for the life. I did not think the enemy would give life. We were told you would not. I am sorry." It is not a dramatic artifact. No general signed it. No battles were decided by it. But it testifies to something essential about the war and about the peace that followed. That even in the darkest moments, humanity persists. That mercy is a choice available even to the exhausted, the frightened, the betrayed. That the abundance Marguerite recognized was not just material, but moral, the capacity to treat the enemy as human. To uphold principles even when expedience suggests otherwise. To remember, in the midst of organized violence, that we are all fragile creatures who do not want to die here, do not want to die anywhere, who cling to life with a ferocity that transcends flags and ideologies and the lies of propagandists. In the end, that was the revelation that changed everything. Not that the Americans had more tanks or more shells or more fuel, but that they had, sometimes imperfectly, but genuinely, a recognition that even the enemy deserved mercy. That even a German soldier bleeding in the snow was a human being worth saving. That the war was not about revenge or racial destiny or thousand-year empires, but about whether the world would be shaped by force or by values, by tyranny or by the difficult, messy, infinitely precious work of maintaining human dignity, even when everything conspired to destroy it. Marguerite Fisher whispered her revelation in the Ardennes in January 1945. The echo carries still. Quiet but persistent, a small voice against the roar of history, reminding us that abundance is not just what we have, but what we choose to do with it. That strength is not just force, but restraint. That victory is not just defeating the enemy, but remaining, through everything, recognizably human. The snow fell on the Ardennes. The medic made his choice. The wound healed. And somewhere in the vast machinery of war, a small moment of mercy testified that even in darkness, even in the frozen heart of the century's worst conflict, light persisted. Not bright, not triumphant, but enough. Always barely enough.